the previous two videos, we looked at how to add a new type of content asset to the engine. And we also looked at how to use asset factories to allow users to create new instances of those types of assets. And then we also saw how we can customize the look and feel of our new asset type. The only thing we haven't seen yet is how to register our newly created asset type action with the editor. And that's something that usually happens during the startup of a module when your plugin module is loaded for the first time. So I would like to use this opportunity to take another look for the third time at how modules work, so you get an even deeper understanding. And just as a quick refresher, remember that each module generally consists of private and public directories. The private directories contain the module's code files that are internal implementation details, and then public files are usually header files that export types and functions to other modules, so they can be used there. And each module also has a module implementation file. That is usually just a small CPP file that declares and implements the module. And then there's also a build.cs file which tells the compiler how this module is to be compiled. So let's look at these two files in a little more detail. On the left-hand side, you see the build.cs file, which is the file that configures the compiler. And on the right-hand side, you see the module implementation file. That's the CPP that implements the actual module. Let's start with the build.cs. The first thing you will notice is that this file is actually not a C++ file. It's code written in C#. And that's because our build tool, the Unreal Build Tool, or UBT for short, is written in C# and not in C++. And what UBT does each time you compile your project is to parse, it searches all the directories in your project for build.cs files and builds a list of all the modules that are available. It then compiles these build.cs files and executes them as part of compilation. And why do we do this? Well, remember that Unreal Engine 4 development is supposed to work not just on Windows and Visual Studio, which is what I'm using on this machine, but we would also like to support other operating systems and IDEs, such as Xcode on macOS or IDEs on Linux, for example. So we're not really able to maintain the settings and the workspace configurations for all of these IDEs in parallel for all these different platforms. And that's why we decided to configure our projects not using the IDE, but using these special C# files. If you are familiar with C++ development on Visual Studio, for example, you might be familiar with project properties. Like if you right-click on your project, you can go to Properties. And there are a number of things you can configure, such as additional libraries that you want to link against, or perhaps paths to directories that contain include header files that you wish to use. But we actually never touch these dialogues. All these properties are set in the build.cs. And here I made up a fictitious module. It's just called test, just to show you how this works. The C# file, it just implements a class that inherits from module rules. And then within the constructor, you can configure a number of different properties. In this case, I only showed two, which also happen to be the most commonly used. The first is public dependency module names, and the second one is private include path. Public dependency module names is a collection of module names that our module wishes to import. So for example, this module depends on functionality that is declared in core and in core UObject. So we have to tell the compiler that if the compiler needs to compile our module, it also has to include the core and the core UObject module. There are several other properties that are similar. For example, there's also a private dependency module names, which is a collection of module names that are required for your module's private implementation. So the private dependencies are only used when compiling your module itself, and the public dependencies, they will also be re-exported to other modules that depend on your module. So if there's a third module that wishes to use functionality in your module, then this third module also needs to pull in core and core UObject, because the types that you made public and that you exported from your module, they depend on other types that are declared in those other modules. I hope that makes sense. Private include path is yet another collection of strings that specify the subdirectories underneath your module's private directory. So if we look into our text asset plugin, for example, here in the text asset editor module, which contains all the code that's specific for the editor, there are several subfolders underneath private: asset tools, factories, styles, and so on. Now, it's important to know that if your module has public directories and this public directory contains subfolders, then our build tool will automatically enumerate those public directories and include them for dependencies that other modules have. But the same thing is not true for the private folder. We do that as an optimization. So for private, you have to, at least for the time being, manually specify which subdirectories exist underneath it. And if you take a look at the text asset editor build.cs, you will see that down here at the bottom, I'm actually specifying all these private subdirectories that I have. And again, I don't have to do this for public subfolders. Those are discovered automatically. And you see the text asset editor build.cs is a little longer than my little contrived example. It has some different dependencies. There's yet another property here called dynamically loaded module names. And there are probably half a dozen or so others that you can look up in our online documentation. Then the next thing that each module is required to have is a module implementation file. And that's usually just consisting of a single class that implements a special interface called iModuleInterface. And there are just two methods in it. In this case, there are actually, I think there's a third and maybe some other methods that you can also override. But in my contrived example, I only overrode startup module and shutdown module. And those are very useful because startup module is executed by the engine each time your module is loaded into memory. So for example, if your module is part of a plugin and that plugin is enabled, then on startup of the engine, whether it is in the editor or in your game or in your application, that plugin will be loaded, and the module will be loaded into memory and have its startup module function called. So this is a good place to perform initialization that you need to do before anybody is starting to use your module. And then similarly, the shutdown module function is executed each time the module is unloaded from memory. So typically that happens at the very end when the engine shuts down. It could also happen if your module is hot reloadable and the current instance of your module is getting unloaded from the module manager. All right, so now we can actually figure out how to register the asset type action that we created in the previous video. Remember, we've gone through the whole process, but the one thing that was missing was to tell the editor that we have this asset action that we wish to use. And if you look at the code for the text asset module, CPP, which contains the implementation of our text asset editor module, here's the file. And I only cut out the important parts for this slide. You can see that I'm using the startup module function to call another little helper function that I've wrote for registering the asset tools. And I also have like another thing here, register menu extensions, which actually I haven't implemented yet, so it doesn't do anything. And then the actual registration happens down here, where we basically load the asset tools module. That's the module that maintains a registry of all the asset tools that are known to the editor. And then we tell that module that we wish to add our own action of type fTextAssetActions. And yeah, that's really it. So at this point, our asset type action is ready to use. We were able to customize the colors, the display text, the tooltips, the context menus, etc. One other thing that I haven't talked about is how to put thumbnails into our asset icons. I'm actually not going to show that in this video because it's a little more involved, but it's also very straightforward. And if you're really interested, I suggest that you take a look at the existing code in UE4. It's implemented for many different types of assets, and the class to look for is called uThumbnailRenderer. So that's the class you would inherit from in order to specify your own custom renderer for thumbnails. And there's some really cool things you can do. You could just render a still image, or it could even be a 3D viewport where you can show animations or other things. So that's it. Once again, remember that we have a lot of modules in the engine, and you can use all of them in your plugins. Just pick the functionality you need and integrate them and add them as a dependency in your module's build.cs files, so the compiler knows what to pull in. All these modules have pretty much the same structure with public and private folders, and they have a build.cs file and a module implementation. And then they each have special functions that you can implement, you don't have to, that are called on module initialization and shutdown as well. All right, in the next video, we're going to look at how to create a custom asset editor UI.